Good evening, everybody. And I am very excited to be able to do my first Facebook Live video with Dr. Samuel Fink. My husband and I were watching TV right at the beginning of the pandemic, and we saw Dr. Fink come on, and we both said, "Hey, we know him." So we were really happy that you agreed to join us for this Facebook Live. Dr. Samuel Fink is an internal medicine specialist based in Tarzana who is currently treating patients with coronavirus. Dr. Fink has been on the front line of educating the public on COVID-19 via KTLA, CNN, Fox, and through his own Facebook Live sessions titled The Fink Tank. Welcome, and thank you again for joining us. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you became one of the leading voices on coronavirus? And tell us how you got into this role, please, Dr. Fink.
Sure. Good evening, Jackie. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to speaking with your listeners and your constituents. It was really by accident. It turned out that there was a group of skiers that came back from Italy. There were 14 skiers, and all 14 of them tested positive for coronavirus. 5 of them were in the hospital, and 4 of those 5 were in the ICU. And I knew when I saw that, I recognized this was something unlike anything I'd seen in 30 years of practice. So one Sunday morning, I think it was March 8th, it seems like it was decades ago, but it wasn't even really 2 months ago. After a cup of coffee with a lot of caffeine, I decided, I'm going to write a post. And I just put it out to my Facebook friends, which I really didn't have that many. And I said, here's what I'm thinking. I'm worried about this. We've got to isolate people. This is going to be bad. And really by later that day, I'd had about 4,000 shares. I had Good Morning America in my living room. And, I don't know how to make something go viral. I didn't even really know what that term meant. But I think, I took my opinion and then it got personalized with the story of the skiers, which really riveted America for a couple of weeks. And that's how I was able to get my message out there that, listen, we got to really think about this. We've got to socially isolate. We have to take this more seriously than we've ever taken anything in my career. And by the way, the 14 skiers, 2 of them are still in the hospital. So this is really significant.
Well, we have so many questions, and we've been dealing with this on our town halls for the last 6 weeks, and it seems every week there is a new focus. And I think over the last few weeks, we've been talking a lot about antibody testing. There have been reports of people being reinfected after having COVID. What are your thoughts on there? And if antibodies don't last, what does that say about vaccine development?
No, and those are great questions. So let's talk first. Let's get to basics. Antibodies. So basically, the ones you'll hear about are IgM and IgG antibodies. The IgM antibodies really occur about 7 to 14 days after you're infected. And if you've got IgM, there's a pretty good chance you've got active infection. They're not definite. It isn't a test whether you actually have it. It's an antibody test. The IgG antibody develops after about 2 weeks, and then it gradually rises over the course of the next 4 to 6. And it'll tell you that not only have you had the infection, but are you making antibodies? There's something out there called the lateral flow immunoassay. That's the one where you prick your finger and then it looks like a pregnancy test. So the technology isn't exactly the same. But those tests are about 50% inaccurate. Now, most of the studies you're reading about, the one in Santa Clara, the one at USC, those were done using those particular assays. And those assays are so inaccurate, not only are they not FDA approved, but even the Chinese version of the FDA hasn't approved them. And that must be a pretty low bar, I would think. They're not even exported by China anymore. So you've got to take some of those results with a grain of salt. So then the question is, what do the antibodies mean? Well, right now, we don't know. There's no really good evidence that having the antibodies prevents you from getting ill. And why did we think that? Because we knew from studies from China, South Korea, and Israel that people seem to get antibodies, but then they would test negative, but then they test positive again. There was a report this morning out of South Korea. They were looking at about 230 patients that were negative, positive. They were positive, they had the illness, negative, then positive. And they're now thinking, and this would be very good news, that the new positive results are the result of the assay that they're using, picking up dead virus. So maybe those 231 people, aren't really sick again. They're just picking up old dead virus, in which case they wouldn't be infectious. And I read whatever I could on this. I think this may be more opinion than fact at this point. I hope it's true, but I don't know that it's true. Another example was there was a guy in Israel, 86 years old. He gets coronavirus. He's admitted to the hospital. He's there 14 days. He gets better. He has 2 negative tests. He goes home. 5 days later, he tests positive. But not only that, he gets admitted to the ICU and now he's intubated. So there's at least one example of somebody that had it, cleared it, and got sick again. So there is so much we don't know. There's a new disease entity to us. We don't really know what, we're trying to figure out day by day what's going on. If we did this a week from now, I might give you different answers.
So it certainly seems, if you look at the numbers, that the second type of antibody tests, the blood draw tests, have a much better possibility of being more accurate with the specificity and sensitivity. Do you think that that they might lead us to a different conclusion than the fingerprint tests?
I think they're more accurate. I think that they'll be able to tell you whether or not you really have IgG antibody, but the bigger question is what those antibodies mean. We've talked about the concept that, what is herd immunity? That means when 60 to 70% of a population get this antibody, that it's very hard for the virus to go from person to person or to really spread. But what if you can't do that? What if you don't really get it? What if you really can still get it again, or you get another strain? Or it only lasts a few months. So those are questions that we haven't developed. So we don't know whether herd immunity will be a thing. I think it will be, but I don't have the facts to back that up.
And certainly if it behaves like most other viruses and bacteria, you do hope that we develop antibodies.
Yeah, right, we do. But one thing we know for sure is that this isn't like any other virus. We're learning new things about it every day. So I'm ready to be surprised. Every day I learn something new that I didn't think was possible.
Well, we've had, a lot of interesting things over the last 24 hours, specifically about beaches. And I think a lot of people are getting sort of restless staying at home. So right now, there's a lot of discussion or controversy about countries like Sweden, who never had any stay-at-home orders, or even Israel, which now is intentionally allowing controlled exposure to COVID. What are your thoughts on Sweden and Israel, and in general, these stay-at-home orders?
Sure. Well, let's talk about Sweden first. Now, Sweden is not completely just open because they've banned large events. There are things that you still can't do in Sweden. I think some of their indoor malls are closed. You can go out to dinner in Sweden, and but even if you look at pictures, there's still, a lot of them are still socially distancing, wearing masks. But because they've been less restrictive, let's look at Norway, Finland, and Sweden, right? If you're on a cruise, you basically hit all of them anyway. So, if you look at Finland and Norway, there are only about 200 deaths there. Now, Sweden has twice the population, and you would expect that there'd be about maybe 400 to 600 deaths. But Sweden right now has almost 2,500 deaths. So they're paying a cost. And really what this is going to come down to is, as you lift restrictions, death rate will rise. How do you make that trade-off? It's a very difficult trade-off, and that's going to be a very important question for public policy. Now, Israel's a little bit different. In Israel, pretty much everybody kind of listens. They were on total lockdown right before Passover. It stayed through Passover. Then they went off for a while. And then for the recent holidays, their recent Independence Day and their Memorial Day, which are back to back, they put them back on lockdown because people usually go out and party. But the populace really kind of listens. And my daughter who lives there tells me that they've now gradually releasing restrictions. You can now go to some restaurants and you can take out, you really couldn't even do that before. And I think there's going to be some limited opening of malls as well. So we'll see how it goes. But in Israel, they say, this isn't working, you've got to lock down, they'll do that. In America, I think once we release, I'm not so sure anybody will listen. Different cultures.
If you look at the Santa Clara test and the USC, the county tests, they are estimating that it's about 5% of the population that has already that has already had COVID. Now that means that we have done an extremely good job of flattening the curve. It also means that 95% of the population, if those studies prove to be accurate, 95% hasn't been exposed to COVID. So do you think that means that we're going to be seeing a second peak later on in the summer or fall?
Well, let's look at the first survey was one from Stanford. So they came out, they figured that the fatality rate was 0.1, I believe even right about what the flu is. So now I took that data and I extrapolated to New York. And because New York, we know the number of deaths, it changes every day. I think as of today, it's about 23 or 24,000 deaths. So it turns out if you took their data and you extrapolate it to New York, that 57 million New Yorkers would have to be infected. The only problem is that New Yorkers only have 19, there's only 19 million in New York. So somehow to make that data work, we've got to find 38 million positive people and put them in New York. So we know that that data can't possibly be accurate because real world information tells you something different. So, but if you did believe it, you would say that, well, there's only 5% affected. So a lot of us still have a long ways to go, meaning that we're still in the first quarter of this game and people are still buying popcorn and sitting down in their seats. So I think we do have a long way to go as far as our ultimate experience. And then the second thing you asked about was about a second wave. Well, right now we're still at the start of the first wave. So, in fact, if you look at our curve, we're still kind of peaking. So it's hard to know. I can tell you in 1918, the second wave occurred in the winter, and then after everybody stopped wearing masks. So if you want to ensure a second wave, you stop social distancing. That'll give you a second wave without any problem. Now, it may happen in the winter anyway. I mean, that's when the flu comes. And why? Because in the winter, we all tend to congregate. Everybody has holiday parties. You have 50 people in a small area. The flu and coronavirus would just love that. And that would give you a second wave. So a lot of it is going to be dependent not only on season, but what we do. It's one of the first illnesses, first national disasters where we, as every individual, has a part in this. We can all help. And I don't remember anything like that.
Right, and switching topics a little bit more to globally, at least initially, it was the developed countries, Western countries that were hit hardest by COVID. How is the rest of the world going to fare? And in continents like the African continent, is there an infrastructure in place in order to quickly distribute vaccine once it's developed?
Well, we accomplished that with Ebola, but it took about 5 years. I was looking at some of the numbers today. I mean, their data collection is so poor, I don't even really have numbers for Africa. I can tell you in South America, their curves are starting to increase, Brazil particularly, and there are other countries as well. India, that curve is starting to come up. Africa, I could not find any numbers, but I imagine it's going to hit those areas hard, particularly in areas where there's a lot of concentration of people. Out in areas where there's very few limited individuals, they're already socially isolating. So it probably won't hit them as hard. There's going to be a problem all over the world. They're not going to escape this. And getting treatment, let alone an eventual vaccine, is going to be very difficult. And many of them are suspicious of the medicine we have to offer.
And the reason that the more developed countries developed COVID first, is that because of the amount of travel?
Well, it may even be a measure. Remember, if you can't measure it, you don't know that you even have it, right? So, I mean, with developed countries, they were able to immediately get on and measure. And I think travel as well. I mean, look at California. We're a big hub for people coming from China. So, in fact, early on, I think this was called the rich man's disease because it was skiers, it was international travelers, people going to Paris for a show. So in many cases, if you couldn't afford to do that, if you're just kind of home with your family, didn't go anywhere, you weren't going to get coronavirus. So there may even still be some truth to that.
Okay, and then switching over to vaccines, which is, that's what we're all waiting for. A number of people, including students, are volunteering to test out different vaccines. But I've heard about students that are willingly exposing themselves to COVID-19 to speed up the process. Will that reduce the timeline of vaccine development?
I mean, it will reduce. I mean, on my show on Sunday, I said that it's going to take about 12 to 18 months, but a lot has changed since to develop a vaccine.
Is that from now, 12 to 18 months from now?
Well, yes. However, a lot has changed since Sunday. For instance, you have Oxford that feels they can have this developed by the end of the year. And President Trump just introduced something called Warp Speed, where he's putting the military behind this. He's putting U.S. taxpayer dollars behind this, and then collaborating with the drug companies. So basically, the approach will be when they have a good candidate for the vaccine, whether we know for sure that it works or not, they're going to start producing vaccine. So that if that version of the vaccine works, you'll already have doses going. And they feel that maybe if this works by the end of the year, if it's possible to develop a vaccine, we'll have enough doses to really get going. As far as college students volunteering, that would certainly decrease the timeline, of course. But is it ethical to expose college students to do that when you have no treatment and they don't have a vaccine? Are we willing to let college students die? And some will by doing this. They're less at risk, but you're still going to have deaths. So that's a big ethical issue.
So there are these efforts to speed up the vaccine, but why is the normal develop? Can you explain a little bit about the timeline of vaccine development in a normal situation? Why was it that in January we were already talking about it's going to take 12 to 18 months, even though we have all the best minds in the world working on this? What are kind of the milestones you have to reach that hold up the timeline?
Well, I think you have to figure out where on the virus you're going to attack. What kind of antibody are you making? Are some parts of the virus easier to hit than other parts? Then how do you, even if you get it, then how do you test it? Usually drug companies are financially responsible. If they try to develop a vaccine and they don't, then they lose all that money. So that slows it down as well. There's a lot of regulatory processes. You've got to get FDA approval for the vaccine. And then once you have all that, you have to make doses. And it isn't just, you can't just produce it. It's not like a molecule or drug. There you can make it, if you can ramp up, you can make a lot of doses. Here it takes time. They a lot of times use egg cultures, but you actually have to make the vaccine, and that's a time-consuming process.
Okay, and then can you tell us about anything exciting going on in therapeutics? I saw something on the front page today that sounded promising. Could you go a little bit into some of the antivirals and other therapeutics?
No, I'd be happy to. First, the first one that we talked about was, and the president spoke about, was hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, which is a common Z-Pak. I mean, since we were all sort of touted that this was going to work, I think a lot of the data on it has been negative. There are many ongoing clinical trials, but from the doctors I work with and from the studies I've seen, it looks like hydroxychloroquine probably does not do all that much. So, I wouldn't put a lot of money on it. I prescribed it once or twice, but I don't think it's that effective. The one that we're talking about, and the news is relevant as of today, is called remdesivir. It's made by a company called Gilead Sciences. And they showed a few things. They showed that what you could do, you could reduce the number of days to recovery from 15 days to 11 days. And they showed that in terms of survival, that you could change the death rate from, I believe it was 11.6 with placebo to 8% with remdesivir. But that number was not statistically significant. In other words, if I take a coin and flip it 10 times and I get 6 heads and 4 tails, I can't write a paper about a coin that gives you 60% heads. And maybe the next time I flip it, I'll get 6 tails, 4 heads. So when something is not statistically significant, you've got to really take it with a grain of salt. I was not so impressed with their data. I think it's something that will be improved. It'll be approved. And I think that right now, remdesivir will be the standard of care for treatment of coronavirus, and it'll be what everything else is measured against. It's sort of like AZT, which was an early therapy in the days of AIDS. Now we have many better things, but that was really the first one. Remdesivir is the AZT for coronavirus. And I think everyone will now get that, and then you'll have add-on therapies to that to determine what works even better. So I'm excited about it. I mean, if I were in a hospital, I certainly would want remdesivir, but there's a problem, and I want your constituents to know you can't get remdesivir anywhere. It's right now only available through clinical trials. And then there's a few sites that have like expanded or compassionate use. And on my webpage, I've listed a link to the website that tells you whether remdesivir is available, but it's not at most places.
All right. And right now we also hear kind of a controversy about whether we're undercounting or overcounting COVID deaths. I saw one article that said even if you account for COVID deaths, that we are at a much higher rate of normal deaths than we would generally be this time of year. And then you hear other stories about if somebody died of suicide, that it turns out that they had COVID, that was being counted as a COVID death. So can you talk about both sides of that argument, and also what does count as a COVID death?
Sure. So let's talk about the argument for overcounting. So if somebody's had, a couple of heart attacks, they've got known coronary disease, and they're admitted to a hospital with a heart attack, and they die, and they're tested positive for COVID, then that will be there. So and I filled out lots of death certificates, unfortunately. So say cause of death is cardiopulmonary arrest due to a heart attack, due to cardiac disease, atherosclerotic coronary disease. What are the other factors? Well, diabetes, COVID. So it's going to appear in that line. But we've done this, this isn't new. We've done this for influenza. We've done this really pretty much for all illnesses. And COVID really is a probably significant reason. If you've got somebody with bad chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and they end up in the hospital and they die, well, the COVID was probably responsible. And unlike a car accident, which would not be. If you had somebody in the street who had lung disease, that wouldn't do it. COVID will tend to tip them over. So that's how some people have argued, well, the COVID deaths are overcounted. In my opinion, they're not, because we really haven't changed anything as far as counting. Now, the other opinion is, why are they undercounted? Well, if you look in February and March, a lot of people were dying at home, and there was this huge increase in cases of like heart attacks at home. And we're thinking that a lot of those may have been COVID. And in New York, particularly, those deaths have not been counted. So you can argue it either way. I think the current number is probably as close to accurate as you're going to get. It is not off by orders of magnitude. If you've got 24,000 deaths in New York, maybe it's 23 or 25. It's not going to be off by much. They probably balance each other out.
And just finally, I think the big fear we have in this area and in the LA area too is the vulnerability of our older population, particularly in care facilities. Even if they're living separately, we see once there are one or two cases that it's, often you see a rapid spread. What is the best thing we can do to protect our seniors that are in these congregate care facilities?
I mean, it's really tough. I mean, my mother lived in an extended care facility, but really it was an independent facility. She had her own apartment, and there were a lot of seniors there, healthy seniors in their 80s and 90s doing activities. So the first thing that my sisters and I did is we got her the heck out of there. So right now she's staying with my sister. So if you have an older relative and it's safe to bring them home, I'd get them out of there right now until we know more about this. Certainly this virus has run rampant through certain senior centers. We want to keep, we're trying to isolate people as much as possible. Right now, in most of these places, there are no group meals or no group activities. The caretakers are checked on a very frequent basis. They wear masks, and they're also practicing social isolation, and that will help. But it's an issue. But it isn't, another misconception, common misconception, that we can all go back to work because there's only grandma down the street that's going to get this. It turns out that the CDC estimates that like 45.4% of Americans, a huge number, have some pre-existing risk factor. It might be age, it might be high blood pressure, it might be heart disease, pulmonary disease, atrial fibrillation, obesity, smoking. There's many risk factors. So a lot of us are at risk.
Well, I really appreciate you spending some of your valuable time with us this evening. Is there anything that you would like to give us as your final thoughts? I'm sure I did not cover everything that you found interesting this week.
Yeah, no, the final thought, I've been saying this now for a little while, but I think it's important, is that coronavirus, does not have a D or an R answer to its name. It's not a Republican virus, not a Democratic virus. I was really hopeful at the start that Americans would come together, as Americans have done throughout generations, and fight this together. But lately, it's turned into another political fight. It's the Democrats versus the Republicans. So we really need to avoid that. No, there are not blue states and red states when it comes to coronavirus, because the virus couldn't care less. We've got to really support each other and get through this together. We're going to have differences of opinion, but we've got to work through those. We can't bash this one, we can't bash that one. And we can't go after the president. We can't go after Governor Newsom. It doesn't make any sense. We've got to bring the best minds together, and we've got to get over this. And we've got to do it in the best way possible. And we've done this before, and I have every reason to believe we can do it again. But please, guys, this is not political.
Boy, those are very wise words. Thank you so much, Dr. Fink, for joining me this evening to educate the constituents here in Ventura County. And I want to remind everybody that's listening that we do have a teletown hall every Friday at 4 o'clock for our English listeners and at 5:30 for our Spanish listeners. All the information is on our website. In addition, if you have any questions that you need answers to, whether it's on corona testing, our favorite topic this week, EDD, please make sure to contact my staff or contact us via the website. And thank you again, Dr. Fink. please keep up the good work. And I want to tell all our listeners today, be well, be kind to each other.